You are never supposed to hear this. The Ashford name was once whispered with reverence. Now it echoes like a curse. Beneath the pine-choked hills of Millbridge, Maine, stood a convent carved from stone and silence. But it wasn't prayer that echoed from its basement. It was screaming, real, human, agonizing, a sound so primal it shook the soul of a lone hunter who strayed too close. Thomas Brewster thought he was tracking a deer. What he found was a chamber, a surgical theater soaked in candlelight, blood, and whispered Latin. The nuns weren't healing. They were cutting into skulls with scalpels, with rods, with purpose, and their patience. Young women declared rebellious, melancholic, or hysterical, never returned the same. Some never returned at all. What you're about to learn goes beyond medical malpractice or religious zealotry. This is ancient control wrapped in the velvet robes of piety. A blueprint not for salvation, but for obedience. They weren't fixing souls, they were rewriting them, erasing memory, surgically sculpting submission. This is no Gothic horror, it's history, suppressed, denied, but never destroyed. You're not just watching a story, you're entering it, and once you hear the truth, you'll never see institutions the same way again. The Ashford Convent was not built to heal, it was built to contain. Founded in 1794 under the guise of spiritual reform for troubled women, it stood on land once used for colonial experiments in behavioral correction, rituals, lobotomies, and mind isolation chambers funded quietly by English aristocrats and Puritan theologians. The land itself was chosen for its silence. No birds nested there, no animals lingered. The locals said the trees leaned away from it, but the Ashford sisters moved in with smiles, habits, and holy hymns. Behind stained glass, they operated under a charter written in code, full of phrases like purification, cognitive adjustment, and womb of obedience. Those weren't metaphors, they were protocols. Each resident who entered their gates was logged meticulously: age, marital status, offenses, family influence, but it was the basement, always the basement, where the real work began. Records speak of metallic restraints built by a blacksmith 2 towns over, tables designed to hold convulsing bodies, instruments imported from Prussia, marked with symbols used by 17th-century alchemists who believed the soul lived not in the heart, but in the folds of the brain. These were not sisters of mercy, they were surgeons of conformity, and you've only peeled back the first layer. By 1807, the Ashford Convent was no longer taking in just the unruly or melancholic. They began receiving women of wealth, daughters of magistrates, wives of merchants, heiresses who questioned their fathers, and one by one, they came back hollow. Their spirits weren't broken, they were erased. Voices once full of wit became monotone. Eyes no longer searched the room, they stared past it. These weren't women cured of sin, they were women emptied of self. The town called it a miracle, they called it peace, but a few men noticed something different. Their wives didn't dream anymore, didn't flinch when burned, didn't cry at funerals. One husband described it like living with a ghost who still breathes. But even ghosts leave traces. These women didn't. And when a midwife discovered scars, delicate surgical scars, beneath their hairlines, questions rose, quiet ones, whispered in taverns, dismissed by doctors, buried by clergy, because every man in town had something to gain from obedient women. But control comes at a price, and what the Ashford sisters took from those minds, it didn't vanish, it moved, it nested, and it waits, even now, to be reawakened, because what they discovered wasn't a treatment. It was a weapon. The town of Millbridge had secrets, but none buried deeper than the ones sealed behind the convent's basalt doors. By 1811, the Ashford sisters were no longer working alone. Correspondence began arriving from Europe, sealed letters from Vienna, Paris, and the Bavarian Illuminated Sciences Society. Inside those envelopes were diagrams, anatomical maps, not of the body, but of belief. Instructions for dismantling identity, reprogramming morality, surgical theology. You see, control wasn't just their goal, it was their doctrine. They believed the soul had pressure points or regions of the brain where shame, memory, defiance could be physically severed. And if you cut deep enough, you could eliminate rebellion forever. This wasn't punishment, it was purification. The Ashford method, as it was quietly called in academic circles, involved sensory deprivation, chant repetition, and precision incisions behind the frontal lobe. No anesthesia. Pain was part of the process, the cleansing fire. They wrote. Their journals reveal chilling detail. Subject 8 ceased using her name on day 11. Subject 12 no longer reacts to infant cries. Subject 19 identified Mother Agatha as her god. This was not science. It was programming, and the worst part, it worked far too well. Not all who entered the convent left changed. Some never left at all. Their names vanished from church records. Their families told they had relapsed or been relocated for further spiritual restoration. But no one ever saw them again, and in 1813, during a rare spring thaw, a trapper's dog unearthed something near the convent's root cellar. A femur, human, cleanly sawed, wrapped in muslin cloth, marked with the Ashford seal. Sheriff Corbin launched an investigation, but it lasted less than 48 hours. He emerged pale, silent, and promptly declared the case closed. Rumors spread that he'd been shown a ledger, one not meant for public eyes, detailing names, family connections, and donations from the most powerful men in the region. The convent, it turned out, had donors, backers, people in high places with low morals who saw the Ashford work not as horror, but as opportunity. Reprogramming women was just the beginning. Could soldiers be made fearless? Could dissenters be made loyal? Could memory be deleted and obedience installed like a machine? The sisters said yes, and those in power listened. From that moment forward, the Ashford Convent was no longer a secret shame. It became a silent institution, protected, funded, and expanded. By 1816, the convent had doubled in size. Stone wings were added, quietly without permits. Tunnels extended beneath the chapel, leading to lower chambers, not marked on any architectural plans. And still, women kept arriving. Some came voluntarily, desperate for healing. Others were brought by carriage at night, sedated, escorted by family members with guilty eyes. None of them knew what awaited. For the Ashford sisters had perfected their system. First, isolation. The subject was deprived of speech, mirrors, clocks, and light. Then, saturation. Endless hours of whispered scripture layered with subliminal tones and monotonous chants. Then came the adjustment, always in the basement, always at night. Records from a recovered Ashford manual describe the procedure as soul realignment through cerebral purification. A thin silver rod inserted through the nasal cavity into the frontal cortex. Not to kill, to rewire. Subjects woke up calm, grateful, devoted, their old selves gone, not just memories, but entire frameworks of desire, defiance, and selfhood, erased. This was not punishment for sin. It was eradication of will, and the convent wasn't acting alone. By now, they had partners, hidden ones, men with titles, men with institutions, men who wanted this technology for the world. Dr. Horace Hartwell was the first outsider to witness the full procedure. A Harvard-educated physician turned psychiatric theorist, he visited under the guise of offering medical counsel to the sisters, but what he found shook the foundation of his career and his soul. In his private journals, later discovered under floorboards of his estate, he wrote, "Their knowledge surpasses anything I have seen in Vienna or London. They touch the brain as one might tune a violin, precisely, ruthlessly." He watched as they took a woman, a former teacher who had challenged her pastor in public, and reduced her to a docile shell in just 72 hours. Her speech slowed, her posture bent, her convictions vanished. Dr. Hartwell should have exposed them. Instead, he joined them, because what he saw wasn't just terrifying, it was effective, and effectiveness is currency to men in power. He began referring other doctors, sending letters to elite medical societies cloaked in coded language. The Ashford procedure may hold promise for correcting ideological deviations at their neurological root. This wasn't medicine anymore. It was weaponized psychology, and it would soon be exported through men like Hartwell to cities, schools, hospitals, governments, because once obedience could be installed, free will became obsolete. Obedience is more addictive than power. Once elites tasted the Ashford formula, they didn't just want to control women, they wanted to control everyone, and the sisters, cloaked in their veils and ritual, obliged, so long as their doctrine remained untouched. Ashford wasn't about greed, it was about order. They believed chaos came from individual will, desire, questioning, emotion. They called it the rot of choice. To them, free thought was a disease, and they were the cure. So the experiments widened. Hartwell introduced male subjects, young criminals, unsalvageables, war deserters. Results were promising. Fear could be deleted, memory fragmented, desire redirected. In one disturbing case, a known arsonist was returned to society with no recollection of fire. Only a blank fixation on order and cleanliness. When asked about his past, he wept, not from guilt, but from confusion. "I don't know who I was," he said, "but I was wrong." These weren't reformed humans. They were rewritten ones, and now the Ashford Convent's reputation was no longer whispered in shame. It was spoken of in foreign embassies, military councils, and secret medical salons. What began as a healing ministry had become a factory of silence. And silence is the foundation of every empire. By 1820, the Ashford Convent was no longer fully under the Church's eye. Officially, it remained a sanctuary for female correction and spiritual medicine. Unofficially, it had become something else entirely, a proving ground, a laboratory, a temple of the new mind. But the most chilling shift was this: the sisters no longer saw themselves as healers or servants of God. They called themselves architects. Their faith had transformed into something darker, older, an amalgam of monastic discipline, enlightened, Mentira brain theory, and esoteric mysticism. They believed the soul could be sculpted like marble. And if you controlled enough souls, you could shape civilization itself. Mother Agatha's writings, never meant for public eyes, refer to the coming symmetry, a future where entire populations could be molded at birth. No more war, no more rebellion, no more desire, only order, only silence. It was eugenics through devotion, neuroscience as theology, suffering as initiation, and the experiments began to spread beyond the convent's stone walls. Private clinics, boarding schools, penal colonies, anywhere humans were unruly. The Ashford methods followed, and no one stopped them, because in a world built on control, the greatest evil is not pain, it's the erasure of choice. You may think this is just a relic of the past, a macabre tale buried beneath centuries of dust and denial, but what if I told you it never stopped? What if I told you the Ashford legacy was simply absorbed, rebranded, sanitized, hidden behind new walls and modern terms? Electroconvulsive therapy, cognitive correction, behavioral compliance programs, the tools changed, the names evolved, but the goal remained: silence the individual, rewrite the defiant, shape the obedient. Modern institutions still chase the same God the Ashford sisters worshipped: order without resistance, obedience without understanding. The Ashford Convent may have shuttered its doors in 1853 after a fire accidentally destroyed the East Wing. But none of the sisters' journals burned, none of the tools were lost, and none of their research vanished. In fact, survivors of the fire recall seeing carts being loaded the night before, crates filled with books, metal instruments, and sealed specimen jars. They weren't destroyed, they were relocated to private hospitals, to state asylums, to military research labs, and to elite universities you still trust. You don't hear about this history because you were never meant to. But if you're still watching, you're not like them, you're waking up. The Ashford Convent was not erased, it was absorbed, its methods embedded like bone fragments into the skull of modern society. By 1860, a new term had emerged in elite academic circles: neurospiritual conditioning. It sounded benign, progressive even, a fusion of science and soul, but it was just Ashford, rebranded, and the key players weren't nuns anymore. They were professors, psychologists, social engineers cloaked in the language of reform. Their targets shifted from women to anyone who questioned. Union leaders, political radicals, children who couldn't sit still in school, they all met the same fate, diagnosed, isolated, corrected, and every generation since has been shaped by the fallout. We call it education. We call it therapy. We call it national defense. But underneath the terminology is a single ancient impulse. Control the mind and the body will follow. The Ashford family name was scrubbed from official records. But its descendants, those who continued the doctrine, still sit quietly in advisory roles on boards, behind mirrored glass in rooms you'll never see. They don't need to scream like the women once did. Their methods are quieter now, more elegant, but every bit as surgical. There's a reason you've never read about the Ashford sisters in your textbooks. It's not that the story was lost, it was erased. Deliberately, meticulously, with precision that mirrors the very procedures they performed, because what they discovered wasn't just useful, it was volatile, the kind of truth that topples myths, institutions, and entire models of human freedom. The Ashfords proved something terrifying. You don't need chains to enslave someone, you only need to rearrange what they believe. They called it internal harmony, but it was mental euthanasia. Erasure of resistance, passion, even memory replaced by carefully constructed obedience. And when this became known to certain circles in the American government during the early 20th century, interest turned to investment. Ashford's writings were recovered from private collections, translated, enhanced, rewritten with cleaner fonts and federal seals. By 1919, a classified program began under the guise of behavioral rehabilitation for war veterans, but veterans weren't the only ones admitted. Disobedient wives, seditious journalists, minorities who wouldn't assimilate, all quietly processed, all returned, reprogrammed or not returned at all, and still, the public never asked, because the surface was calm. But underneath, something monstrous was growing. In 1947, under the smoke of a world reborn from war, the Ashford doctrine reached its next mutation. It was called Project Larkspur, classified, untraceable. Funded by the newly formed CIA and cloaked in Cold War paranoia, its aim, behavioral destabilization of hostile actors. But what they really meant was, how do we make a man forget what he believes and accept what we install? And where did they turn for inspiration? Ashford recovered documents from the convent, long thought destroyed, were retranslated by American neuropsychiatrists, and within those yellowed pages they found gold, maps of the brain with annotations in Latin and Old English, noting where courage breeds, where resistance flares, where obedience sleeps. Larkspur used this as blueprint. Patients were brought in, some volunteers, many not. They were told it was therapy, but what they received were electric probes, sensory flooding, induced trauma followed by conditioning episodes. And in every control room, behind mirrored glass, sat men with notebooks, nodding, silent, calculating. Ashford's ghosts had become architects of the future, not through religion, not through guns, but through the remapping of belief. And the public, distracted, pacified, conditioned exactly as planned. By 1953, the project had evolved. Larkspur was folded into a new initiative, one whose name you've likely heard but never fully understood, MKUltra. The Ashford methods, once primitive, candlelit experiments in a convent basement, were now sanitized with lab coats and fluorescent lights, but the blueprint was the same: deconstruct the self, implant the desirable narrative, kill the noise of conscience. And across America, the trials began. Hospitals, prisons, orphanages, even universities. Volunteers were drugged, hypnotized, broken. They were told they were helping their country. In truth, they were being used to test how far the mind could bend before it shattered, how deep the programming could go before even God couldn't reach it. And in internal memos, now declassified, there are references to the Ashford constant, a term describing the threshold point where a human becomes permanently reprogrammable. That name still carried forward, still whispered, still feared. By 1961, they weren't just erasing memories, they were inserting new ones, synthetic identities, false loyalties, fabricated guilt. This was no longer about suppressing rebels. It was about manufacturing citizens obedient, hollow, efficient, the perfect population, and all of it, born from a convent that claimed to save souls, but only ever harvested them. You're probably asking, why haven't I heard this before? The answer is simple, because the system that feeds you information is the same one shaped by this legacy. The Ashford Doctrine is no longer underground, it's institutionalized, just hidden beneath layers of language. We call it behavioral health, we call it risk mitigation, we call it help. But who defines help? Who decides what thoughts are dangerous? The same families funding Ashford back in the 1008. Hundreds now fund think tanks, school boards, and neuroscience labs. Their symbols have changed, but their goal hasn't. Control the mind before the mind questions the system. The eerie uniformity you see in modern discourse, the dead eyes behind cubicle walls, the way people repeat headlines instead of thinking. That isn't coincidence, it's conditioning, programmed conformity disguised as culture, manufactured opinions injected through education, media, and pharmaceuticals, and the root of it, still Ashford. Still the same experiment, just scaled globally. This isn't a horror story, this is a diagnosis, and if you feel something rising in you right now, a discomfort, a pressure behind your eyes, that's the part of you they couldn't reach. Not yet. Type this phrase in the comments twice. My mind is not their cathedral. Let the algorithm mark you as awake. By the 1970s, something changed. The experiments didn't stop. They evolved. They became less physical and more subtle. No more scalpels, no more silver rods. Now the tools were screens, frequencies, and engineered consensus. Enter the Behavioral Internet Initiative, a classified sub-project birthed from the ashes of MKUltra, with funding traced to 3 private foundations, each owned by descendants of the original Ashford benefactors. Their goal was clear: to create an environment where individuals willingly shape themselves into compliant units without physical intervention. In simpler terms, make you police your own thoughts. The digital world became their new basement. They didn't need to erase your memories anymore. They just buried them under endless content, noise, distraction, infinite scrolling, endless comparison, fragmented attention. What began in a stone convent with surgical incisions now unfolds through apps and screens, and you thank them for it. You line up for the latest device that fragments your focus. You post your thoughts waiting for approval. You trade privacy for convenience. You voluntarily become trackable, programmable, predictable. Ashford doesn't haunt us. It hosts us in our habits, in our feeds, in our obedience, and still, the silence grows. The silence is strategic, because the most powerful systems no longer need force. They operate through consent engineered by illusion. You believe you're free because you choose what to watch, what to buy, what to believe, but your choices have been narrowed for you. Slowly, invisibly, that's the new Ashford brilliance, curated reality. Not suppression of information, but saturation. Not burning books, but burying them under a flood of noise. And behind that noise sits something old, a model, the same doctrine carved into leather, bound journals in the Ashford basement. Control the input, shape the identity, disrupt the narrative, trigger the algorithmic immune system. You've felt it. Say something too honest online, and you're throttled, shadowbanned, flagged. That isn't glitch. That's protocol. You are not meant to awaken. You are meant to assimilate. But the human soul has a defect in their system. We remember pain. We question silence, and some of us resist patterns. We see the uniform smiles. We hear the mechanical language. We feel the dead air behind digital connection, and we know this is not real freedom. It's curated obedience, and somewhere beneath it all Ashford still whispers. There's something they fear more than rebellion. They fear memory because memory is identity, and identity is power. The Ashford sisters understood this in 1812 when they etched notes into the margins of their surgical journals. To erase her memory is to erase her defiance. But memory is not just what happened. It's what we believe happened, so they didn't just erase facts, they replaced them, rewrote history, sanitized darkness. What was once a chamber of screams became a center for female renewal. What was once psychological warfare became therapeutic recalibration. And you were raised inside that rewritten world. They didn't have to change your mind, they just had to own your history. You pledge allegiance to institutions that trace their roots to Ashford. You repeat values programmed into you by systems born from brain surgery and spiritual sterilization. You don't even know what you've forgotten. That's the point. But now something's shifting. Men are waking up. Patterns are cracking. The glitch is showing. And if you've made it this far, you're not just watching anymore. You're remembering. You're reconstructing something ancient, not rebellion, but sovereignty. Sovereignty terrifies them. Not because it's violent, but because it cannot be shaped. It remembers, it resists. It reclaims what was stolen, the sacred right to think, to feel, to know, and once a man reclaims that, he becomes ungovernable. Not chaotic, clear, not rebellious-rooted. That's why the Ashford system has always targeted memory, will, and identity. Not to destroy men, but to hollow them, to make them predictable, placated, processed. A silent citizen who questions nothing and forgets everything is far more useful than a loud revolutionary. But here's the truth they never anticipated: the human spirit is recursive. You can burn the journals. You can silence the whistleblowers, but the story survives in symbols, in rumors, in the discomfort behind smiles, in the quiet voice inside you whispering, "Something's wrong." They've tried everything to suppress it. And yet here you are watching, remembering, reclaiming, and you are not alone. Thousands of others are here, descending beside you into the truth, a silent brotherhood forming behind the veil, and when enough remember, the system will crack. Not with explosions, but with awakening. They can't program a man who sees the code. This is where the descent ends and the ascent begins. You've seen behind the curtain now. You've traced the thread from a snow-laced convent in 1794. Through basements, blood, and boardrooms, into the very screen you're watching now. The Ashford doctrine didn't die. It simply evolved from scalpels to screens, from hymns to headlines, from holy water to hashtags. And yet, something they never anticipated is unfolding right now. You're remembering, not just the story, but yourself, your sovereignty, your power to refuse their script. They can edit your textbooks. They can shape your entertainment, but they cannot overwrite the man who rewrites himself. And if you felt something stirring during this descent, a heaviness, a hunger, a knowing, that's the part of you that was never colonized. They fear that part because it's the only thing they can't own. It's ancient, it's sacred, and it's waking up. Type this phrase twice in the comments to lock your awareness into the algorithm and signal the others: my mind is not their cathedral. My mind is not their cathedral. Because once enough of us remember, they won't be able to forget.